Okay, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, both you in the conference hall and you online. My name is Åsa Gyberg Karlsson, and I'm a political member of the National Council of Medical Ethics. I have the honor of chairing this afternoon's first session, where we will explore in vitro gametogenesis, or IVG. IVG is a technology that aims to create eggs and sperm from stem cells. This could transform assisted reproduction by making it possible for people who do not have the possibility today to have genetic offspring, such as people who for various reasons cannot produce gametes by themselves or same-sex couples. IVG research has made great progress in recent years. In Osaka, Japan, Professor Hayashi and his team has succeeded in producing both eggs and sperm from mouse cells using induced pluripotent stem cells, iPS cells. Recently, private companies have also begun to take interest in the technology with the aim to make it available for clinical use for the future. The Swedish National Council on Medical Ethics has been engaged with the ethical implications of IVG for many years. Discussions began in 2009, followed by a 2013 report on assisted reproduction that introduced IVG and highlighted potential ethical questions. In 2018, the Council formally addressed the topic in the letter to the government, recommending a review of the current legislation considering scientific advancements. However, a comprehensive ethical analysis has not yet been conducted. The rapid development makes it increasingly urgent to address ethical and other issues raised by IVG. Today, we are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts who will dive into the ethical and legal dimensions of IVG. Before we welcome our first speaker this afternoon, we would like to inform you of a minor change in the program. Unfortunately, Anna Singer has had to cancel her participation. But now, it's time to introduce Professor Stephen Wilkinson, a distinguished professor of bioethics at Lancaster University. Professor Wilkinson is the principal investigator of the well-funded Future of Human Reproduction project and member of the National Council on Bioethics. Professor Wilkinson, welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear that? Great. Okay. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. Very much appreciated, and thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be here in Stockholm. So I'm going to talk about IVG, in vitro gametogenesis, and really just give you a bit of an overview of perhaps the most, what I think see as the most interesting ethical and policy issues that it raises. And so my talk is called, what questions should we be asking? And in the spirit of some earlier presentations, there'll be more questions than answers, but I might have one or two tentative answers in there, and maybe we can explore some of those things in the Q&A. So I've divided the talk into 5 parts. A bit of background and acknowledgements. What is IVG? What could it do? What ethical and policy questions would this raise? And how much of this is new? should we be worried? I probably should have added, should we be excited? I don't want to be wholly negative. So yeah, what would be an appropriate reaction? So kicking off with background and acknowledgements. So I mean, I suppose quite a bit of what I'm going to say comes out of the Future of Human Reproduction project, which has already been mentioned. So this is a Wellcome-funded research development award, which looks at the cultural, ethical, social, legal issues raised by new technologies as these affect human reproduction. And it's not a science project, it's a humanities and social sciences project, but it is quite interdisciplinary. So we're bringing together colleagues from bioethics, design, English literature, law, linguistics, and psychology. There are 7 investigators, 4 project staff, a number of research collaborators, and an expert advisory group. So it's a large team, and we're looking mainly at 3 sort of areas. So this is a great event for me to be at because they're nearly all being talked about in different ways. So ectogenesis, artificial womb technology, is one of the things we have been looking at. IVG is one of our main themes, and also genome editing in a reproductive context, although we haven't done so much work specifically on the latter because that tends to come up alongside other things. I'm also working on a IVG policy briefing note, which is having quite a prolonged gestation, but will hopefully be with us next year, which is a collaboration between the Future of Reproduction team and the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, especially colleague Ran Svenningberg, who's done a lot of the work on that. So my colleagues Sarah Varg, Laura O'Donovan, and Nicola Williams are working with me on that, and we're hoping to put together, I suppose, the briefing paper will be a lot like this talk, only significantly longer in the sense that it tries to give an overview of what the relevant ethical issues and policy issues would be. So the aim of that is to try and give policymakers a framework to help think through those questions. So those are my acknowledgements. So this is not all me. So number 2, what is IVG? I say I'm an ethicist, not a scientist. So I'm not going to attempt to give you a lot of scientific detail, but in general terms, IVG, which has also been termed artificial gametes or synthetic gametes in the past, is a set of techniques that would enable us to, using stem cell technologies, to generate eggs and or sperm outside the human body in a lab setting. And eggs and sperm could then be potentially derived from almost any bodily cell, ultimately. So you might be able to take a skin cell and create a sperm or an egg from it. And as well as being potentially a very valuable tool for research, this could, in principle, and I'll say more about this later, open up all kinds of new reproductive technologies. So same-sex couples, for example, could both be genetically related to their children. If you have a situation where a man can have an egg derived from his body, or a woman can have a sperm derived from her body, all kind of possible combinations then come forward. So you may have been aware of these reports from last year. So this is from March 2023. The one on the left is from the Guardian newspaper. The one on the right is from Nature. And these are both reporting a case in which scientists created a mouse with, as they put it there, 2 dads. So this was a sort of animal application of IVG. And so obviously you can imagine this potentially being extended to humans. You could have 2 male parents. And so there's a couple of quotes from, I need to put my glasses on for this. So Hayashi, who led the work at Kyushu University in Japan, and is an internationally renowned as a pioneer in the field of lab-grown eggs and sperm, predicts it will be technically possible to create a viable human egg from a male skin cell within a decade. And there's a quote here, purely in terms of the technology, it will be possible in humans even in 10 years, he said, adding that he personally would be in favour of the technology being used clinically to allow 2 men to have a baby if it was shown to be safe. I don't know whether they'll be available for reproduction, he said. That is not a question just for the scientific community, but also for society. So I guess that sort of throws out the challenge to us as people interested in ethics to start thinking about this. If the people on the cutting edge of science are suggesting that this could be possible in 10 years, I mean, I'm not really qualified to say whether that's correct or not, but I don't think he's the only person to have said this. Another interesting thing worthy of note is that there's a lot of commercial sector interest in this. So perhaps the most notable example is a company. I don't know how well you can see that, but there's a company, you can look it up for yourselves online quite easily. There's a company called Conception, which is based in California, which is doing work on IVG. It was interesting, I actually met the chief executive and founder of this company sort of early in the year, and it was very interesting to hear what he had to say. So just from this text on the website, they say, we want to help parents have kids. We aspire to make the future generations healthier. We're working on a stem cell technology called IVG that could give families the opportunity to have children at much older ages, eliminate barriers for couples suffering from infertility, and allow everyone to have biological children. I think biological there means biologically related. Long term, this technology could be a critical platform, allowing for widespread genetic screening, and if proven safe, it could even eliminate and reduce the risk of devastating diseases for future generations. So, so that's another page from the Conception website. So I suppose the reason why I'm flagging this is just because it does, I mean, as a bioethicist, I try not to be a sort of predictor of the future too much, because that's not really my job, but it's worth having an eye on how much optimism there is in the scientific community and the business community about these things happening. I mean, they may not, but it's definitely worth, if we're being precautionary as ethicists, it's definitely worth kind of being ready, because it's possible that this will happen within 10 years. And there's clearly a lot of investment going into this by the looks of it. And in particular, the Californian model, I think marketing this to same-sex families who want to have children, I think obviously opens up significant kind of commercial potential for that in the American context. Part 3, what could it do? So I've tried to divide possible uses of IVG into 3 broad categories. The first one I would describe as kind of less radical, and here we're looking at, I suppose, applications which could either replace or improve sort of existing things that we do. So examples that, so IVG in this sense is perhaps more of the challenge is perhaps more technical rather than fundamental. So under this heading, I would include just generally increasing the supply and availability of gametes for reproductive and research purposes. I mean, it could mean the end of egg and sperm donation. I suppose that is quite radical in a way. But obviously, if IVG became very safe and effective and cheap, then the call for donor gametes could be incredibly limited. If anyone can have sperm or egg made from other parts of their body, then I guess unless you've got some particular unusual preference for donor gametes, why would anybody use donation? So, I mean, that's quite a big thing, you might think. It could be used to replace existing IVF techniques, and when we ran a conference on this earlier in the year, I hadn't really realized until people spoke about this so much at our conference that actually it could just have a really big effect on mainstream IVF, because current egg retrieval methods in particular are not cost-free and not risk-free and not discomfort-free, whereas if IVG became very, very easy and effective and you could take a swab from somebody's mouth or their arm and then make some eggs, that's a lot better than conventional egg retrieval. So it could actually be, you know, a safer, more convenient, less uncomfortable, more effective way of just getting eggs from mainstream IVF. So that's one possible use we might have in this first basket. And finally, in this sort of less radical end of things, it could be quite a valuable alternative to egg sperm or embryo freezing when this is used for fertility preservation purposes. For example, when people are undergoing chemotherapy or radiotherapy, often they need to freeze or decide to freeze gametes. So you could use IVG instead in that situation. And again, if IVG became easier, safer, more effective, it might just be a better option for people. So that's the first category, kind of things which would perhaps in relatively modest ways technically improve upon existing practices. Then we get into the second basket, which I'm calling kind of more radical. And I've already mentioned same-sex couples. That's one thing which is radical. So obviously same-sex families exist legally, socially, but they could become genetically related in the same way that different sex couples are. Another even more wild possibility is what's been called in the literature multiplex parenting, where a child is born with, well, I should have said 3 or more actually, but 4 or more progenitors. And I think, again, I'm not going to do the science, but essentially what's going on in this case is that you get 4 people. Imagine you pair them off into 2 pairs. Each one creates an embryo one way or another. And then you've got 2 embryos, which could then themselves, without developing beyond embryos, be used to create more gametes. So one of the embryos creates an egg, one creates a sperm, never having been sort of born and as a person. And then you end up with, that sort of now funneled down to 1 embryo, which then, is gestated and becomes a baby. So you've got 4 progenitors, and you might say, there's different ways you could describe this. You might say, well, the embryos are the parents. That's one way you could describe it. You might say there is no parent, or you might say the person has got 4 parents, which are the 4 original progenitors. But whichever way you cut it, this is going to be a totally radically transformative way of creating families. Now, why anybody would want this is a question we can discuss later. But it's something that could happen, and there are multi-person social families. Maybe some of those multi-person social families would want to create children such that each adult has got a 25% stake genetically, as it were, in the child. That's possible, and people want all kinds of things, don't they? So I should say I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying it could happen. The third sort of more radical thing, I think this is more radical, is enabling much older women to produce eggs. So I think the oldest reported case of a woman becoming pregnant and giving birth with her own eggs is a sort of mid to late 40s, although with donor eggs it could be later. And I think the oldest reported case of a man fathering a child, I've only done a cursory Google on this, so don't take my word for it, is early 90s, right? So possibly late 80s. So there's a big disparity there, and IVG could, allow women to create eggs at potentially a much older age. Now, whether they then go on to gestate them themselves is a separate question, but they could be genetically related. So you might say it evens up the differences between the sexes as far as gamete production is concerned. So again, this is in that more radical basket. Finally, I put this in its own category because I think it's only indirectly related to IVG, but there's something that IVG could enable. So if IVG allows us to create lots of embryos, in theory, that would enable us to do a lot of testing on those embryos and to be quite choosy, quite selective about which ones are eventually put forward to reproduction. And also, you could potentially put them through multiple generations. So you could create embryos from embryos that have been selected and then select within that pool. So a bit like science experiments where you try and speed up evolution. That's possible, and so it could give us a lot more control over selection of traits in future people. Again, these are just things which are possible, not things which I'm saying are good. Right, so part 4. What ethics and policy issues would this raise? Well, it's been impossible not to actually hint at many of these along the way. A bit like the different applications, I guess some of them fall into the sort of more standard categories and some are more sort of distinctive and new. There'd be a set of questions around consent and information, just as we have with most technologies. So what's required for valid consent in IVG? Are existing consent networks for tissue donation or gamete donation acceptable, or do we need to change them? One interesting issue would be around this is more of a policing and enforcement issue. What do we need to do to ensure that gamete theft doesn't take place? Because obviously if you can make eggs or sperm from relatively small amounts of tissue from a person, we would all then be at risk of somebody taking bits of tissue, creating a gamete and creating a child. So how do we stop that from happening? And also, what is the status of that child? If somebody did that to me, would I be its father, their father, or would I just be a victim of a crime? So there's a few issues there. Perhaps particularly celebrities and people like that might be at risk of this happening. There's questions about what information IVG-created children should have. Are they exactly like particularly when a third party's been used. So I suppose if you've got two parents in a social family and one of them uses IVG, that's just a bit like using fairly standard IVF or something like that. It's just a matter of, it's within the family. But if there's a donation aspect, if the gametes for some reason come from elsewhere, are IVG created children, should they get just exactly the same rights or status as donor conceived people or not? It's an interesting question. I mean, my initial thought would be probably yes, but there might be some special reasons why not. Other kind of issues we might have would be about sort of safety and the welfare of the child. So this always comes up when we talk. This come up several times today already in the context of other technologies. There's some of these issues are sort of more technical in nature. So how should we design trials? How much follow-up do we need, and so on. Some of them are perhaps more philosophical in nature. So one is, when we're thinking about whether, I think about the idea of equipoise, if you're designing a clinical trial, so the new intervention has to be at least as, roughly speaking, at least as good as or believed to be at least as good as the conventional treatment if you're going to sort of trial them side by side. How would that work with something like IVG? What do you compare it with? Do you compare it with existing known practices like donor conception and surrogacy, which, as we've heard earlier today, seem to be quite good in terms of safety and child welfare? Or do we compare it with something else that's a more sort of new risky technology? So that's one interesting issue. And how does it change that comparison if you live in a country where one or both of those things is not allowed? If surrogacy is not available or donation is not available because of the legal situation in your country, does that then drop out of the ethics of designing the clinical trials? They say we can't do that. So IVG is perhaps more justifiable in that situation, whereas if surrogacy and egg donation is readily available, it perhaps takes more of an argument to justify trying IVG in that situation. So so there's some philosophical type questions. I won't say much about this, but there would also be in each country a set of more sort of legal questions around what a parent is. I already mentioned earlier what would happen if somebody sort of stole my skin and then made a sperm out of it and then made a baby. There's those sort of questions. And so does IVG would provide new biological routes to parenthood? Would we need to create new legal categories or changes in the legal definition of parenthood to accommodate that? And then moving on to selective reproduction, which I've already mentioned, brings with it a whole set of issues. So I've already mentioned that we could use IVG to create a large number of embryos and then do extensive selection. So this idea comes from bioethicist Hank Greeley in his book, The End of Sex. And he uses this expression, easy PGD, meaning that PGD, this is all very hard to say, IVG and PGD combined could enable you to do what he calls easy PGD, and basically this means the volume of embryos and the ease of creating embryos would be so great that a lot of selection that's not now practically possible would become possible. So he talks about a possible future where selecting embryos based on genetic traits becomes routine, accessible, and inexpensive due to technologies such as IVG. Now, it's worth saying that, these issues aren't radically new. There's a huge, for many years, decades, there's been a huge discussion of what kinds of selection, modification of embryos and future people would be acceptable. So this is not new, but I think the scale and the ubiquity of this technology might be a sort of game changer. I was trying to think about analogies for this, and one might be something like smartphones and cameras. Cameras have been around for ages, but they used to be quite big, and you'd have to go and get a film developed a long time ago. But the fact that there's just cameras everywhere now, and that I think you might think that actually leads to social and ethical change. For example, the concept of privacy changes. People no longer take privacy issues so seriously, or what counts as privacy might change. So you might think that the scale of easy PGD, as he puts it, would potentially perhaps just change our attitudes towards selecting future people in ways like the camera example. So the kind of issues raised, I mean, these are all familiar from other contexts, but, so one question would be, would this scenario raise concerns about embryos being wasted or not respected if you've got lots and lots of embryos being created and not used? What are the long-term consequences for future generations? Might this be seen as or be eugenic in some ways? Might it have negative effects, be that symbolic or tangible, on existing or future people with disabilities? That's a really important issue for us to look at. And could this be used for features other than those related to health, such as cosmetic features or enhancements? And if so, is that something that should be worrying to us? So, almost finally, funding and access. So again, this is not new or specific to IVG, but all of these technologies will bring questions around who should be allowed to access them, how should we prioritize potential recipients, under what circumstances should IVG be publicly funded. I think the funding issue is quite interesting, particularly in countries where some types of assisted reproduction are funded. Should IVG fall under the same criteria? So, at a minimum, obviously, we'd need IVG or IVG used in a particular way to be as safe, effective, and cost-effective as any other mainstream ART treatment. So it needs to kind of perform well enough in a purely cost-effectiveness sense and in a safety sense, maybe with a bit of flexibility in a trial period. But as I alluded to earlier in the safety discussion, there will be perhaps some more philosophical questions about what we compare with what. So some of the applications of IVG, such as if we're using it for fertility preservation for people undergoing cancer treatments, you might say, well, you can compare IVG with gamete freezing or embryo freezing, and you might just be able to do a fairly straightforward cost-effectiveness analysis there, which is best for the patient, what are the costs and the risks, and that's perhaps relatively straightforward. But if, as I mentioned earlier, you're trying to compare IVG with something quite different, such as gamete donation or surrogacy, and surrogacy perhaps, there you're raising more sort of philosophical questions, and particularly the one at the bottom there, which is how do we assign public value to the value which individuals place on having a genetically related child? Because there are other types. People can have a perfectly good social family, which is not genetically, where the children are not genetically related to the parents. So given that, it is sort of funding the genetic link as this extra component that people want. Is that a valid thing for us to be sort of publicly funding? The fact that if we fund IVF, then that suggests perhaps we do think that's okay. But there's at least a debate whether delivering genetically relatedness is something that is a valid recipient of public funds, because it doesn't necessarily improve outcomes, given that you've got other ways to go. You've got donation and surrogacy. And then, of course, these issues will be particularly forced when we look at the alternative things. Like I was talked about multiplex parenting earlier, where you've got 4, 5, 6 progenitors rather than 2 parents. Solo reproduction, actually, I haven't mentioned, but that's another possibility where both gametes come from the same person, and eggs for older women. Are these all things that should be funded by a publicly funded health service, or are these sort of lifestyle choices that should be privately funded? So I'm asking the question, not giving you an answer. Same-sex couples, again, I mean, there's some of the earlier papers talked about the medical-social infertility distinction. I think this sometimes comes up here. So obviously same-sex couples who want to have a genetically related child are not suffering from medical infertility, or at least they needn't be, in the sense that their reproductive systems could well be working 100%. But because of their sexuality, they're not obviously able to reproduce in the natural reproduction is not a possibility. So what should we think about this? Is this like these other cases? Is it a lifestyle choice, or is it something which merits public funding? I mean, I think in the same-sex case, there is a very strong equalities argument for supporting this. So even if you don't think it's a form of medical infertility, you might say, well, in order to give everyone in society equal access to biological relatedness, we're going to sort of, support this, and that's a very good thing from an equalities point of view. So, I mean, that's sort of a tentative answer from me, and we could talk about that more later, but I think I can see a strong argument for that, which perhaps doesn't apply to some of the other options above. Although even in multiplex parenting, you could say, well, that's an unusual family form that some people just have, and so we should support that. So, anyway, good. Right, almost at the end. So, how much of this is new? Should we be worried? Should we be excited? Final reflections from me are, I think a lot of the issues that we're looking at here around consent, information, welfare of the child, are fairly standard issues. But it's not to say they're easy, but I think we probably have models from other areas which we can import into this. So I don't think they're necessarily totally game-changing. So, but it certainly needs to be looked at carefully, though. However, as I've alluded to, there are some really quite new things here that would require really deep reflection. One of them is the creation of new biological types of family. Now, most of those biological types of family have got social analogues. So there are same-sex families now. There are multiplex social families now. There are complex ways of raising children. So all these things exist in society. But the question is, should we invest resources in making those sort of also biological forms if those people want that? And I think, so there's definitely something new there in terms of types of biological family that we'll have to think very carefully about. Second one, I think the point about selective reproduction and the fact that embryo selection could become much more widespread is very important. I mean, it's possible, I've mentioned on the slide, that will just be eclipsed by other things. I mean, perhaps sort of genome editing and so on would be a much more effective way of delivering that if people wanted to do that. But this idea of easy PGD would be potentially quite a radical social change if it was adopted. And finally, I think equalising the ages at which men and women can produce gametes would lead to quite significant attitudinal and social change. I mean, in principle, again, because of the equalities argument, I'm reasonably excited would be overstating it, but positive about that. Maybe it's just a good thing. If men can father children in their 80s, then I'm not saying it's a good idea, but at least from an equalities point of view, why not let everybody do that? So, right, I think that's it. Thanks very much for listening. Good.
Thank you, and there will be room for questions in the end of this session. Now I would like to welcome our first commentator, Professor Emerita Susan Gollenbach from the University of Cambridge. Professor Gollenbach, whom we met earlier today, is a world-renowned expert in family research and the former director of Center for Family Research. We look forward to hearing her perspective on the social and ethical dimensions of in vitro gametogenesis. Just a second.
Can you hear me? Oh, I think that's better. Great. Well, thank you for inviting me back again to speak in the afternoon. So what I want to do, I'm just speaking for a short time to really look at Steve, what he's been saying from the perspective of children. Again, it's quite speculative, but just to think about the different kinds of families that could possibly in the future be created by IVG and what the implications are. So I want to talk about 3 different family types. Firstly, the use of IVG by infertile heterosexual couples, by same-sex parents, and also by single parents. So first of all, if we look at the infertile heterosexual couples, here the children will be biologically related to their mother and their father, just like children born through IVF using the parents' own gametes. There's now a lot of research on such children. One of the largest longitudinal studies was the European study of assisted reproduction families, which was a study that involved intensive assessments of 116 IVF families from 4 European countries when the children were 6, 12, and then finally at age 18. And to cut a very long story short, we found at age 6, a bit like the surrogacy families I told you about earlier, that where there were differences, the IVF families were doing better than unassisted conception families, and the children were well adjusted. By age 12, these differences had disappeared, but the families were generally functioning well, as were the children. And also at age 18, they continued to show high levels of psychological well-being, and they weren't concerned, reflecting back on their conception by IVF. So in terms of thinking about the implications for IVG, then really, because IVF doesn't have a negative impact, if anything, a positive one, on parents' relationships with their children and the children's psychological well-being, it seems very likely that that would also be true of children born through IVG if they're genetically related to their parents. Now, as Steve mentioned, one possible use that might be a popular one is the use of IVG by same-sex parents. So I'd like to say a little about what we know about lesbian mother families and also gay father families in terms of outcomes for children. In the very early days, and by that I mean going back to the 1970s and early 80s, there was a lot of concern about lesbian women having children because this was something that generally hadn't been thought about before. And it was argued that the parents might be less nurturing than heterosexual parents, that the children would be at risk for emotional and behavioral problems. But that was all a long time ago. There's now a very large body of research from the 1970s onwards on children in lesbian mother families, showing that these children are no more likely to experience psychological problems than children in traditional heterosexual parent families. And recent research has focused more on the specific strengths of lesbian mother families and found that in some aspects of development and parenting that these families do particularly well and are especially well prepared. In terms of two-parent gay father families, then that's something that generally happened a bit later. And even though the research found no risk of problems, raised risk of problems for children with lesbian mothers, it was argued that gay father families were different because men are generally less suited to parenting than are women, and also that gay father families are more likely to be exposed to prejudice and discrimination than lesbian mother families because the parents are both male. There's been less research on gay father families than on lesbian mother families, but there now have been quite a few studies, and one that I actually just realized I mentioned this morning, so I won't go through it again, but a study that we carried out of gay father families formed through surrogacy found that these families were doing well, and the children actually were doing especially well in terms of social and emotional well-being. However, although we know that in terms of quality of parent-child relationships and children's adjustment, then the families are no different or are doing just as well. If we look at studies that have focused on the thoughts and feelings and experiences, so more qualitative studies about families with same-sex parents, the research shows that sometimes the non-biological parent feels excluded, feels that they're not treated so much as a parent as much as the biological parent, either by members of their own family, people in their social circle, or people in their wider social world. And often they can feel quite alienated because although they're just as involved in raising the child, we're just as involved in the decision to have a child, they're not given the same parental status as biological parents. So as Steve has already pointed out, this would, in terms of the equality argument, it would enable both parents in same-sex parent families to be genetically related to their children. So it would enable the children to have a more equal relationship with each parent. I mean, this may not happen in practice in the early years. For example, in lesbian mother families, generally the child is more likely to be securely attached to the mother who breastfeeds and so on. But certainly as the child grows older, they would have an equal genetic relationship to both parents. But also, and importantly, others from outside this immediate family would treat the non-biological parent more equally. So it would therefore, in that sense, provide greater security to children. And another positive aspect would be that both parents would be involved in the process of having a child. The third type I want to mention are single parents formed through IVG. And here I think it's important to make a distinction between single parents who use IVG to create, like a woman to create an egg or a man to create sperm, that's used in conjunction with donor eggs and sperm. So just as single parents have children today, which is very different from the scenario that Steve mentioned earlier about single people creating children from eggs and sperm created through IVG from their own bodies, because these children would only be genetically related to one person, that is, their parent. And I think the consequences are very different. So if we think about the more old-fashioned way of becoming a single parent through IVG, I mean, we heard this morning about interesting research. One study I'll mention is one we did in the UK, again, single mother families through donor insemination. We compared 51 of these families to 52 two-parent families, also created by donor insemination. And again, the findings in terms of the children were at age 6, and then when we followed them up again at age 10, that generally the families were functioning well. But and in Italy, there have been similar research on single fathers with similar outcomes. But in terms of using IVG so that single parents create both the eggs and sperm is something completely different. It's a completely new kind of family. And it's something that, you know, we just haven't had before. So really novel, fundamentally different. And it's, yeah, from single parents through donor conception. And one issue here is that children born to single parents through donor conception, they may not know who their donor is, but they do know that they have somewhere a biological father or mother, which can be important because they can form mental representations of this person, even though they can never know their identity or form a relationship with them. We also know that the donor is very significant, can be significant for some children of single mothers. So again, in our study, we found that children born to single mothers by donor insemination, many of them began to ask about their father from as early as 2 to 3 years old. We also have found that children born to single mothers by donor insemination are more most of them don't see the donor as their father, but more of them do than in children either with two lesbian mothers or with a mother and a father. And we also know that children or young people of single mothers are more likely to search for and sometimes to want to meet their donor than children of lesbian or heterosexual couples. So these findings suggest greater psychological challenges for children with only one genetic parent. I should also say at this point that this is unlikely ever to happen anyway, because the risk of genetic disorder of having a child in this way in itself would be enough for this to be banned. But, you know, as we're in the business of doing thought experiments, then it seemed, for the sake of completeness, I wanted to mention these families. I won't, because of time, say anything about multiplex families that Steve also mentioned, except just to point out that in terms of children's identity, something that we know to be very important is this notion of family history and families passing down stories about their family, creating family memories and so on. So, you know, missing out a generation, again, it's something that's fundamentally different we've never seen before, but it does make me wonder what it might do in terms of children's identity, because there's sort of gap, and they would only know, in fact, their genetic grandparents and wouldn't have any parents. So, just to sum up, it seems that IVG used by infertile heterosexual couples and by same-sex couples and by single people in conjunction with donated gametes seems unlikely to have an adverse effect on children's psychological adjustment. But families in which children are genetically related to only one parent, or, as we've just said, in multiplex families who don't have parents at all, are fundamentally different from children in any existing family form. And research on donor conception suggests that such families could present a psychological threat to children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Finally, we welcome Associate Professor Santa Slokenberga from Uppsala University. Professor Slokenberga specializes in medical law with a particular focus on biotechnological advancements and their regulatory frameworks. We are eager to hear your thoughts on the potential legal implications of in vitro gametogenesis.
Thank you so much, and my pleasure to be here and give a very brief insight on what questions does the big picture that Stephen painted in his presentation on the ethical, legal, and social issues raise when it comes to the Swedish legal perspective. And I have to say, I have been given about 5 to 7 minutes, but each of those questions is worth a PhD thesis on the topic. So if I try to cluster them to make use of my time that I've been given, one has to say these questions can at least be grouped as follows. One, scientific research. The other, assisted reproductive technologies. And the third, rights and interests of children. So, conceiving a child through assisted reproductive technologies is something that we've heard a lot about today, and that's a standard medical practice. However, as a practice, it's not that old either. Now it's 46 years since we had the first child born as a result of assisted reproductive technologies. We are learning about the long-term implications of what it means to use this technology. So before something becomes a standard medical practice, research must be carried out. So I asked myself, but how does the Swedish law look like when it comes to regulating research in this field and when it comes to regulating the actual care? And one central law in the field is the one already discussed, quite sometimes mentioned, the Genetic Integrity Act. So how does that one respond to these questions? If we open the law, we see, well, the law is silent. But there could be some provisions that are of relevance to the questions that IVG raises. And one is a chapter on genome editing. And in that chapter, we have a prohibition to carry out research and care interventions that lead to heritable genetic changes. But we also now sense, but why is she taking that question up? That is quite far from IVG. That could be one potential scientific application later on in the future. So that one is not overly helpful at this point. Second, if we look further in the Act, we have a chapter devoted to research and care in connection to reproductive technologies. And that chapter specifically focuses on gametes, eggs, sperm, and fertilized eggs. It has been drafted with reproductive cells in mind in more traditional way. A question then is, can we apply these provisions that we find in that chapter to IVG? And finally, we have two more important chapters in the very same Act. One chapter that regulates the questions pertaining to insemination, and the other chapter that regulates questions pertaining to in vitro fertilization. And the chapter on insemination focuses on inserting sperm in a woman's body, and the other chapter on IVF focuses on fertilization of an egg outside of a woman's body and insertion of that fertilized egg back in the woman's body, not necessarily the same woman necessary anymore. So what we see is that these provisions in the law are drafted, they are there, they could be relevant, but the legislator had a different intention. The legislature meant the traditional cells. So we as lawyers, what do we do when we have a technological challenge and the law is not really responsive? We have a tool called legal interpretation, and there we look at one specific method, which is called theological interpretation. And that one too can be broken down into diverse parts, and two main can be derived in the Swedish legal context. We like very much stick to the legislator's intention when trying to understand the law. And how do we do that? We go back to the preparatory works. So at the time when the law on genetic integrity was drafted, this technology was not on the table the same way as it is today. So naturally, there isn't so much helpful to apply the Genetic Integrity Act to the specific challenges at hand. We have another way to address the question through theological interpretation, and that we got instruction from the Supreme Administrative Court earlier this year, where the court dared to take a step aside from preparatory works and look at the intention of the legislator expressed in the aim of the law in light of the actual wording used in the provision. And if we apply the same logic here, we could argue, yes, quite some provisions will certainly be applicable if it comes to that, if we need to address a challenge. However, where does it take us? At best, that we address IVG in exactly the same way as regular sperm donation, as regular egg donation, insemination, and the use of IVF. And the question is whether IVG raises fundamentally the same questions as insemination and IVF as we know today. And I think we all got an insight from both presentations just before that. I have the honor to reflect on that questions are similar, but at the same time, there are significant differences that we need to think about. And Anna Singer was supposed to be here today, stand by me, and she couldn't. But earlier this year, what she did was she delivered a talk at the Royal Society of Sciences on this question. And what she said there is pretty much relevant to today's question. She took the point of departure in child's best interests and reminded that in the Swedish constitution, the society should care for children and make sure that the rights and interests are observed. And she also meant that child's best interest has been something that has been central in shaping both Genetic Integrity Act as well as the Parenthood Code in Sweden, Chapter 1, regulating who can be actually a child's parent. However, if we look more concretely into those cases, and because of time constraints, I will give you an example of the law on genetic integrity. If we go back to the 1980s, it was very much biological, genetic parenthood. The man who gave consent to the use of his sperm was the father. So now, as we heard several times today, we are in the case where Swedish law doesn't think that for child's best interest to be met, we need a genetic link to the parents. So in her talk, Anna Singer said as follows, with this in mind: as long as we believe that the best interests of the child in assisted conception is to be able to have legal parents, and we have the opportunity, albeit with some effort, to ensure that this happens, perhaps everything is in a good order. But then she continues, at the same time, when it comes to new technologies, this conclusion sits rather uneasily with her. And she means if the child's best interest is only to have parents, then there is a quite obvious risk that the child becomes a hostage to the parents in order to fulfill the desires that the parents have, a means to satisfy others. And I think this goes pretty much in line with what the representative from Norway earlier today said, that the discussion was about moving from gifts to commodities. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I will welcome all the speakers for these sessions up on the stage. And it's time to invite you for questions and comments. And please wait for a microphone before you speak. And for you attending online, please write comments and questions in the chat, and it will be read out loud. So, any questions? You're gobsmacked. So, any questions online? Mikael? No? So I can start with one question. If you could offer one piece of advice to policymakers as they prepare for the potential reality of IVG, what would that be? We start with you, Stephen.
That's a great question. It's probably going to be a sort of procedural answer, which is, I think, listen carefully and listen widely and to the scientific community, to all of the potential stakeholders that could be affected by this, which is really wide-ranging. It could be people who want to use the technology, same-sex or other different family forms, those people from those communities who wish to use this to sort of have genetically related children, see what they've got to say, see what disability rights advocates have to say about their concerns about selection. So I think have a really big conversation, an open conversation, look at other countries, whatever country you're starting from, look at the rest of the world and see how they're doing it. And so have a big conversation, an open conversation, and it will take time. Also start now, because it's a big job.
Yeah. Susan?
Yes, well, that's a difficult question, because normally I would say to policymakers, as well as, your opinion, public opinion, and so on, please also take into consideration the findings of research, because often people have prejudices and assumptions that can be challenged by the findings of research. But in this case, of course, it's very difficult, because if I'm thinking about the impact on children, then the children won't exist till the procedure actually can happen. So that puts me in a dilemma, because I can't say that. So I suppose the only thing I would say is, in a sense, this is like IVF and, in the late 1970s, where people were really very, very concerned about it. There was quite a reaction against IVF and talk about Frankenstein children and all this kind of thing. And in fact, over time, as more and more children were born, it became clear that the children were doing fine. So maybe this is a bit like that, a bit of a storm in a teacup. But we won't know till the children are actually born.
Mm-hmm. Santa?
One thing that immediately comes to my mind is the need for robust and technology-neutral regulation. And the reason for that is we've discussed in the country genome editing and implications and whether the law has any loopholes. We've discussed enhancement, whether the law has any loopholes. And while these discussions have been taking place, in the world, first children with edited genomes have been born. And then a question is, are we as a society ready to take the responsibility that follows with not having had adequate legislation in place to prevent these different things from happening? I'm not saying that these things are wrong as such, I'm just saying whether we've thought all questions through and whether the interventions are considered safe and so on. So there are plenty of questions to be addressed. So a neutral, robust legislation that sets down principles we want to abide by when it comes to new technologies with long-term implications for the society.
Thank you all. Any questions? Oh, yes. 1, 2, 3. So, start from... Yes.
Okay, so my name is Sara Belfrog and I work at Stockholm University. So picking up on the last reflection, or the reflection that the last speaker ended with on the move from gifts to commodities, I was thinking about this aspect of commercialization and patients becoming customers and so on. It has been brought up a few times today. So I would just like to hear, in general, your views on the role that commercialization plays in the field of reproductive technologies.
So, Susan?
Oh, I thought you were asking the lawyer here rather than the psychologist.
Thank you so much. I have to say, I haven't worked specifically on this question, but more generally, the Swedish law is open to commercial actors being involved. But then when it comes to paying for certain services, again, we have some regulations in place, to what extent they are adequate. So that is a question on the spot I will not be able to comment on, but it's certainly one that is worth reflecting on.
Any other reflections?
Well, one would be just to reiterate a point from the presentation, which is that it seems to me that perhaps particularly in the US, there'll be a lot of commercial interest in IVG, and so it's liable to be driven by a very aggressively commercial private sector at the cutting edge. I guess also to reiterate, for me, I would be sympathetic towards some public funding of some IVG once it's beyond the research stage, if it gets to that point, just because it looks a lot like other assisted reproductive technologies. And when they're unjustifiably in the private sector, there are lots of downsides to that in terms of equality of access and some of the perverse incentives that commercial providers have to provide, add-ons which are not necessary and to just generally try to extract money from the consumer. So I'm quite pro-public funding, at least for limited a non-commercialization, if you might say, for a limited set of IVG uses. So I'd be on board with that.
And Santa, you had...
Yes, thank you. Just to reflect more on what Stephen said, and one thinks about generally the law, we have the public law and the private law, and private law offers great flexibility. And in the absence of public law in the field, what we saw when it came to direct-to-consumer genetic testing, there was a lot of discussion regarding 23andMe and other large companies, but we had also these companies in Sweden carrying out different kind of testing and marketing to consumers. And if we do not have legislation in the field that is adequately governing the technology the way society considers it necessary, then we will end up in a situation where it will be a market-driven phenomenon. And that, I have to here draw a little bit parallels. There's been discussions regarding surrogacy in Sweden too, but we don't have a law. What we have instead is that the Supreme Court had to step in and address the question of parenthood when it comes to adoptions, for example, from the US. And when it ends up being the fact that there isn't a biological parent, for example.
Thank you. We move on to the next question, and that was a lady just in front of me.
Thank you. So I think there's a lot to take in with what you have said, and now we are talking about same-sex couples having children and so. But I'm also thinking about tissues we have in the freezers from persons that are deceased today, or maybe that aren't deceased today, and I'm thinking what big opportunities this technique would give. Also maybe to wake dead persons or to keep a person alive forever. And should we at all allow this technique? We don't even discuss it. We think that this is coming and we cannot stop it. And in that case, in how many years do you think this could be a technique developed?
Interesting comment. Santa?
Thank you very much. This raises important questions. And when preparing for the presentation, I thought, but it can't be so that it's the sole competency of the Swedish legislature. And in the EU, thank you very much. In the EU, we have a legal framework focusing on advanced therapy medicinal products. And when reflecting on genome editing, I thought, but how about somatic cell therapy? So it could be well so that the EU steps in and starts acting in the field, but that is the regulatory part. But the question is safety, that was already raised earlier, and whether the existing thresholds are adequate to move forward. When it comes to the content of the law, when it comes to research, there seems to be quite some room for discussion. So, thank you.
Yeah, Stephen?
I mean, your question reminds me that there are. I mean, in my talk, I actually cut out a few of the very most radical possible uses of IVG because I had limited time and I thought they were less kind of urgent from a policy perspective. But one of them, which I could have mentioned, was using IVG to create gametes from the recently dead. In the case of people, so if somebody's recently died, you could take a tissue sample and use IVG to make a sperm or egg. I mean, obviously that does already happen in some cases where you try and extract sperm from people who have recently died and so on. So that is technically possible now, but yeah, IVG would enable that. It would also enable, or could enable, I should say, de-extinction, according to some scholars. So you might, if you can get a tissue sample from an extinct species, you can bring it back to life. So I didn't go all the way down that very radical route. I didn't say as much about solo reproduction. I'm glad Susan mentioned one person reproducing. Again, I think that's one of the least likely human applications ever to be permitted largely for safety reasons. So, but yeah, there are many more things we could potentially do with IVG. I was sticking to the more sort of conservative end in order to explore live policy options for now.
Susan, do you have any reflections about being a child of a parent being dead when it is conceived?
No, that would be really speculative, I think. I mean, my only thought is that in the UK, this has been quite, there have been some very high-profile cases, and the law is that unless this person has given consent before they died, then it's not allowed. So I imagine the law could, is likely to be the same, unless it changes for everything, like extracting sperm. Yeah.
And even if we apply the law on genetic integrity with the best interpretation, we land in a similar result. We have a provision when it comes to using gametes from the deceased donors.
And there was a lady back there somewhere. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm from Durham University in the UK. So one thing I was thinking while you're all speaking is that really transformative uses of technology tend to take much longer to come about than the more immediate things that you mentioned, Steve. And so, just as an example, we have had publicly funded IVF in the UK for a really, really long time, and it's only in 2019 that we start publicly funding lesbian same-sex couples using the technology. So my question is, do you think that will be the same story for IVG, even though, in theory, society's moved on quite a long way and we have same-sex marriage now and so on and so forth? Will this be an opportunity to really see that there's still quite a bit of, for example, homophobia embedded in the way that we regulate assisted reproductive technology? Another use that might be helpful to think through this example is people who want to contribute a different kind of gamete to that which they might make based on who they are assigned at birth. So, for example, somebody assigned female at birth who identifies as a man might feel more comfortable making a baby with sperm. And so is that something that we should permit? Is that something that's likely to take longer for us to allow? Sorry, long question.
No, it's interesting. Susan, will you begin?
Yeah, I mean, the last one, I think I take some thought. So I think I'll leave it to the others to perhaps answer that one. But in terms of the first issue, it's an interesting one. Have we moved on so that if something becomes possible, that can be just as beneficial to sort of non-traditional, or people wanting to form non-traditional families as traditional ones? Is it going to move forward in the same time, in the same way? It's a hard one. I don't know. I imagine in the UK, if it was about family types that are now kind of allowed and facilitated by law, then probably yes. But then you were also referring to having a lot of this work, as you know, has happened in the private sector. The problem is the issues get raised in the National Health Service where resources are limited and so on. And I think under these circumstances, it's really hard to know. I think probably health authorities would want to say this is for people who are, physically can't have children because of some illness rather than because of social reasons. But whether that would actually fly any longer in the UK, I don't know. But interesting question to think about.
Santa and then Stephen.
You raised
Sorry, okay.
No.
You raised several interesting questions, and I'm not sure I'm competent to answer any of them, but all of them raise some reflections. So when it comes to the use of technology and whether we will start using it in clinical care, I think it hinges upon several questions. One is safety, already discussed, but the other is also the principal provision that the country needs to take. Do we want this technology to be applied in the clinic? And again, it could be so that it will enter because the legislator hasn't done anything, but also here at this stage, before that happens, the legislator has a room to take the positions. What is that we want for our society? The second question is regarding the same-sex family perspective. I think we learned a lot from the way the Genetic Integrity Act evolved. What Anna Singer meant in her talk earlier this year was about the father became the one who gave consent to the use of sperm. Child's best interests were attributed to the biological parenthood, and it took a very long time, well, about 40 years, for this to evolve and land in the formation of the act where we are today. I think we've learned a lot. We have already those lessons. So I'm not sure we might step into exactly the same questions, but certainly new ones could emerge. And then your last point was regarding, should we take X or Y cell from, which cell should be created, or sperm or egg? It's difficult. If we follow biological principles, that will give you a straightforward answer. At the same time, we need to look at the scientific perspective behind the risks involved, and I'm not sure about the state of debate in that regard, how far the research has already been evolved. So one way is to look at the principles that we have in genetic inheritance, but whether there is room for deviation, and if it's relevant at all to discuss, that's a question.
Stephen.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, it raises some interesting questions. I mean, this is a bit speculative. I would have thought that in the case of the same-sex couple, maybe there'd be more hostility to funding than there would to allowing. So if you've got a current scenario where there were two men and a surrogate and an egg donor, I guess the egg donor is being replaced by IVG, and maybe that doesn't look too different from a kind of public perspective. They might ask a question about why are we paying for it when we are not saving, when we haven't got enough money for life-saving medical treatments. I think that's a general attack on funding ARTs, but it's particularly pronounced in the same-sex relationships area, and I guess that's perhaps because of discriminatory attitudes, but also because people perhaps try and fall back on this social medical infertility model and say, well, there's nothing, as it were, pathologically wrong with these people's bodies. It's different from somebody who can't reproduce because they've got damaged sexual organs. So I think that's that one. I think, yeah, the gender identity one, I hadn't actually thought about, but it is a really good case because you can imagine, let's say, a trans man who could now use this technique to create sperm to do all kinds of things, but let's say inseminate a woman, and so can have that role. Yeah, again, I think if it passes the safety test, I can't see that being any more objectionable than anything else that people might already object to because they've got sort of discriminatory attitudes. But yeah, I think it sounds okay to me if the safety's there. Again, there might be a question about funding. Why are we paying for this? Because it's not life-saving medical treatment. That's going to keep coming up. But yeah, I'm going to add that to my list. Thank you.
Thank you. Göran Kolster.
Thank you. This opened up a lot of perspectives and scenarios, and we're really far out in some way here. Therefore, I think was what this Santa said about children from gifts to commodities, as you said. And it's a little, in some aspects, a scary development I can see in front of us. Can you say something about two aspects which I think are quite important? I mean, when it comes to reproduction and so, genetic variation seems to be an important value, and in all life, so to say, plants and also I think when it comes to human beings. And how can genetic variation be preserved, or is it the risk that this will lead to some kind of in another direction? And the other is, of course, equality. It opens also up, as I can understand, for elitism and also discrimination if we are not cautious. Could you comment on these two values, please?
Are you ready, Stephen?
I have a go. Genetic diversity. Well, yeah, probably a majority of IVG interventions that we described would not impact one way or the other on genetic diversity. I mean, some could. So the easy PGD scenario, I mean, you could, in theory, imagine a scenario where there's widespread selection in favor of a narrowing set of traits. So I guess if you were regulating PGD and selection, you'd probably want to not encourage that and not allow that. The scenario where one person provides both gametes, I mean, if that was widespread, you might think that that was a problem for genetic diversity. It would need to happen a lot to be a sort of global threat. So I probably don't see IVG as being particularly damaging on that front. I mean, there are possible uses of it, there could be, but I think if they're regulated, I don't see a big risk. Can you remind me what was the second one? Quality. Oh, quality. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think the various applications of IVG often do raise equalities issues, and these have different forms. I mean, some of them. I mean, I mentioned about ages and the age at which you can produce gametes. I mean, that's, as it were, a factual, natural inequality. And you might think it's a good thing if we can level that up. That's a different kind of equality from where we're discriminating against one group or other. So I appreciate that's a different type of argument. But I think IVG I think there's a strong equalities argument for many of the applications of IVG, all other things being equal, it gives opportunities. I mean, on that Conception website that I put up, admittedly, that's a commercial website, but that was saying we want everybody to have a biological family or to have that opportunity. So that's the big sell, the big positive argument for lots of different forms of IVG. There are arguments against as well, but a lot of the positive arguments are around establishing genetic links, but also enabling everyone to have what only some people have now.
Santa, I saw you.
Yes,
writing.
I do take notes to reflect. Your comment makes me think about the right to private life. The way it's protected in the European legal orders, generally, it's not an absolute right. And reproduction is part of the questions that pertain to private life. Then one question is, if to allow it, and the other question is how to allow it. And these are two different thresholds that need to be passed. And whereas the genetic variation question certainly could be an argument that weighs in, I think that equality question is a one that has so many nuances, and so that gives rise to so many further questions that need to be explored. But when it comes to legal assessment, both of them would have place in addressing at least those two questions, whether to allow the technology, and if so, how, under what circumstances.
Any more reflections on that question?
I think I agree with Stephen in terms of the diversity issue, because let's say a woman was unable to produce eggs, but it was possible for her to produce them through IVG from a skin cell, for example, then I don't think that would have any impact on genetic diversity. Same if it was the man in an infertile couple. In terms of equality, I think certainly in terms of lesbian couples and gay couples, it would create equality because the person who's a non-biological parent, as I mentioned, sees themselves as being in having an inferior status in relation to the child, as do other people. So from that point of view, it could actually be beneficial in terms of equality and the quality of family life.
Yes, any questions online? No. Any more questions in the audience? Lotta.
I have a question for Stephen. I know that you recently have been in contact with some of the most leading researchers in the field. So I'm a bit curious about the timeline. Do you dare to predict when we have clinical trials?
I think, a slightly boring answer. Views vary on this matter. I mean, I think the most optimistic is the one I mentioned earlier, where Hayashi and some of the commercial people have said sort of within a decade. I've heard others say more pessimistic things, or that there are aspects of human biology which mean that it won't be a seamless transition from mice through to other more complex mammals through to humans. So I can't say. I mean, my only conclusion would be, given that some people are saying within a decade, it would be prudent to keep this fairly high on the ethics and regulation agenda, because sometimes nothing happens for ages and then it all happens at once. So yeah, I think it's definitely worth keeping on the radar. But I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I'm looking for people to be interested in IVG. But it's I think 10 years plus is probably the timeline, but the plus could be quite a big plus.
Any more questions or comments? Yes, Per?
Well, I was just thinking about the metaphor that it could be, compared to a storm in a teacup, and the opposite would be, I guess, Pandora's box. So could you comment on that?
Yes. What do you think?
Yeah. Will anyone
Yeah.
open the Pandora's box. Santa, you seem eager.
I can do that and give others time to reflect a little bit more. I think one can draw very much parallels with gene editing already mentioned, and the fact that whilst we were discussing in the academia among policymakers, we have a ban in Europe, no heritable genetic changes. We don't have a universal ban that binds all countries. There is no such an international agreement, but there is consensus. And at the same time, somebody does that. So now, when we're talking about, at that time, if I recall correctly, we're talking about 2 children. If that is a storm in the teacup, on the one hand, it's a very limited number of human beings at this stage. On the other hand, if we look at the implications it brings along, it's a fundamental question about changes in the human genome, something that we've safeguarded for so long. It's a question about heritability, how the humanity will look like, and all of a sudden, those some isolated cases become huge questions to answer. And in those questions, of course, is fundamental values, how do we want humanity to look like, but also questions regarding the safety. And even though they are at this stage limited, isolated, and perhaps 10 years far away from reality, I think they require quite some attention.
More comments?
Just very quickly, I went to a talk a couple of weeks ago in Cambridge by Azin Sourani, who's one of the leading scientists working on the development of IVG gametes. And one thing he said was 20 years, but then I think he's a very cautious, conservative person, so I think Steve's more likely to be right. But interestingly, when he talked about the uses of this, thinking about Pandora's box, the use of IVG for the treatment of fertility was 3rd in his list. First, he had embryo research. Secondly, he said agricultural uses, and then came for helping people with fertility problems. So, I mean, I don't know enough about these fields, but I imagine the Pandora's box may go well beyond the treatment of infertility. I mean, who knows what might happen in agriculture, and certainly where embryo research might take us. So probably the Pandora's box scenario is more likely than the storm in the teacup one.
Stephen?
Yes, I mean, I think that's really, thanks Susan, I think that's a really important point. It might be used in other areas beyond human reproduction in more important ways. I mean, for human reproduction, I guess for quite a while, it's likely to be only a really small proportion of human reproduction which involves this because, well, first of all, most of the world can't afford it and don't have access to it. Second of all, if you're a heterosexual, not medically infertile person in fairly standard circumstances, you wouldn't need it. You probably wouldn't need it for anything. I mean, you could use it for selection or something, but by and large, people are not going to get down the route. So, and not all same-sex couples will want it. Some of them, I mean, when the conference we had earlier in the year, there was someone presented some really fascinating social science research from the States, the United States, and they did interviews with potential users of IVG from same-sex communities. And there was a significant body of opinion within those communities that was quite hostile to it because they didn't want to go down this sort of geneticization route. They didn't want to be assimilated into the sort of heterosexual genetic family model, so they were quite hostile to it. Others were really into it, but it was quite sort of split. So anyway, my point is that not even all same-sex couples want it. So we're probably talking about, I mean, compared to IVF, which is what's one of the 2% of all babies in the UK, I think, and even that's 2%, that's not much, but IVG is going to be a real minority thing, I think, for ages, even if it's allowed. So I don't think, maybe the lid of the Pandora's box is just a teeny-weeny bit open, but it's not, I don't think it's going to be flooding out anytime soon, not in the human reproduction area anyway, but it could, yeah, if you're talking about cattle or something like that, perhaps that will be a whole different area.
Santa, do you have any reflections on the reflections?
Maturing, eventually. Thank you.
Eventually. And any more questions, comments online? No? in the audience? Do you have any comments on each other's speeches?
I think my comment has matured to become a question to Stephen. And perhaps even Suzanne could comment. When it came to gene editing and heritable changes, one of the questions we asked was, but which is the beneficiary group? And today we've highlighted some, and some of those groups raise more questions than others when it comes to the science, the safety of the intervention. What are the most persuasive arguments to justify public funding, resources, and human involvement in the experiments when it comes to thinking about potential beneficiaries of the intervention?
Right, specifically in relation to a sort of selection of,
I just think, to help the audience, when it comes to clinical trials, we think, but what's the standard therapy? So we need to take that as a point of departure, and we do have some alternatives that could help some groups, but at the same time, we have groups that might not get help under the existing options.
Yes. Well, I suppose if you're looking for the positive case for allowing IVG-based selection of embryos, the easiest positive case to make would be around screening out life-shortening, painful, heritable disorders of various kinds. I mean, who the beneficiaries are there is always a difficult philosophical question, because you're actually preventing some people from coming into being and replacing with them some others if you're selecting between embryos. So that does raise, the standard concerns about eugenics and selection and so on. But if you're going to make a sort of public health case, you'd be looking at conditions where it's clearly very bad for the person being born to have those conditions in terms of either quality of life or length of life, or they might not survive. So, I mean, that would be the easiest case to make in terms of the strength of the argument, because it's grounded in the sort of welfare of future people. But in a somewhat abstract sense, since those people will not come into existence, and that's indeed what the process is aimed to be. But was that the sort of thing you had to find? Yeah.
Thank you.
And did you have any reflection on that?
Well, just along the same lines, I mean, the International Committee on Heritable Genome Editing and the WHO Committee, the two main ones, if they concluded, as you probably know, that were this to go forward, heritable genome editing, it should only be for life-limiting, very serious genetic disorder. So I agree.
Any more questions? Any more reflections? No? Then, thank you all for, yes, very interesting.
Thank you.
I don't know about you, but I have more questions than before, but that's a good sign in this, in the field of ethics. And now it's time for a coffee break. And we will be back 3:45 for the next interesting session. Thank you.